Welcome to Module 5, everyone. In this module, we're going to look at qualitative methodologies, and I have to confess that I'm much more comfortable with this module as most of my research has actually used various qualitative approaches to research. I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, but it's important to recognize that research follows many paradigmatic streams, but the methods or approaches to the research, which we've considered last week and this week, are generalized as quantitative or qualitative, or together as mixed methods. The reading in Module 6 takes this up in much more detail and draws together many of the pieces of the puzzle that we've been talking about as separate pieces in a way, and puts them together in a more coherent whole. So I know that for some of you, for example, you may be frustrated when I write something in a paper or in on your form or whatever that kind of expands on or even corrects in a certain sort of way some presumptions you may have about quantitative and qualitative research. And that has nothing to do with your mark, so I want to put that out there. But I do want to kind of be hinting or providing information along the way that will clarify misunderstandings that can easily come up when we talk about this in a kind of piecemeal way. But it's a necessary part of the process. So getting to know about research is a very complex animal. And so for us to be able to look at the whole, we first of all have to understand the pieces that make up that whole. So that's what we've been doing up until this point. And then Module 6, in many ways, will bring that all together, and you will also be, of course, talking about various research approaches. So, so I just want to put that out there, and suggest to you that it's really important in that first part of Module 6 to really pay attention to that reading and to the video, so that some of the misconceptions that maybe have been rattling around or questions that you've had and that you've asked me about, hopefully that will clarify some of that. But before we consider qualitative research as one of those pieces, I wanted to talk briefly about some of the upcoming assignments. I hope you've had a chance to watch the video that talks about the assignments in Module 5, and of course talks about the assignment in Module 6 as well in much more detail. I hope it was helpful, but briefly in Module 5 you will once again prepare an annotated bibliography using the same format you used before in the first part of this assignment, so you're now moving on to the second part of your assignment, or part 2. This time you're going to annotate 7 articles, only 2 of which may be from a professional journal. You don't have to take any from a professional journal if you don't wish to, but if you wish to do so, you can only use 2. In addition, you will include a synthesis of the 7 articles as they relate to your potential research topic. And this part of the assignment suggests that each of the readings used for your annotated bibliography needs to explore some aspect of your topic so that you can synthesize key aspects across the 7 readings in relation to your research topic. In addition, there will be a forum in which you will consider a question drawing on themes from the articles assigned. So you've got 2 assignments in this module, the larger assignment as well as the forum, which is equally as important in many ways. Last will be an assignment from Module 6 in which you will prepare and present a concept map for your colleagues, and I talk about that in the video, and of course there's a much longer description of that assignment as well in the descriptions of each of the assignments on eClass. All aspects of this assignment are discussed in the video, and so if you have any questions about it as we approach it, then please feel free to ask them. I just wanted to note as well that in Module 6, it's a longer module. So while it sounds like there's going to be a lot going on in that module, you'll actually, in fact, have a significant amount of time to complete all parts of the module and the assignments required and so on. And because it kind of pulls things together, there will be time for us to discuss questions you may continue to have about research and so on. Okay? All right. Your readings for this week include Chapters 7 and 8 of Creswell and Guterman, in which they discuss collecting qualitative data in Chapter 7, and they look at the various ways for analyzing and interpreting qualitative data in Chapter 8. Michael Patton is an evaluator who has done a great deal of work in the health sciences, particularly looking at qualitative methodologies and their efficacy for thinking about and evaluating what happens in health. I find this really interesting, actually, because I've taken on a volunteer role since I've retired as a patient advocate with Island Health, particularly in the area of cardiology. And part of my role is to work with the Cardiology Quality Council, where much of the data we look at actually is quantitative. For example, we might be looking at the quality of patient outcomes at particular times of the day for certain procedures and that sort of thing. This gives great information around issues of concern for me because I have some heart issues, concern now for my daughter and so on, but it is qualitative research that enables the cardiac departments to see how various practices affect patients, or to identify areas that patients have identified as detrimental to their continuing health following research from the hospital, for example. And this actually is an issue that has come up in my work in a significant way when I've been talking to large groups of cardiology patients and getting their feedback in terms of what are the concerns that they have about what's happened to them, about the kind of care that they received and so on. And it's that kind of black box piece between when they leave the hospital and when they get to the cardiologist, and their feelings and their sense of vulnerability during that time. That doesn't show up in quantitative studies, but in qualitative studies does, and then we can move forward in significant ways. So I think this demonstrates to a certain degree that the work that that both of these approaches are valid depending on the question being asked. So so I just put that out there as thinking about how Patton might be helpful to you in thinking about education research, for example. Creswell and Guterman actually do a masterful job in introducing researchers to the hows of qualitative research, how to organize the research study, how to decide on different kinds of sampling for qualitative data collection, how to decide on the size of the samples and whether that size is legitimate, and finding in the findings that you might get from that a data set that's quite small as compared to a very large data set, and so on. Ethical considerations in gaining permission to conduct research, the kinds of data that you might be pulling together, for example, interviews, focus groups, open-ended questionnaires, documents, documentary evidence, that is, audiovisual materials, for example, arts-based research using photography, and these are just some examples that I know of, quilts, drama presentations, and so on, and ways to collect data so that it is useful and so that it's credible, and so on. Organizing data, particularly qualitative data, needs careful attention. As you can imagine, transcribed interviews can quickly become a binder full of text, many binders full of text, depending on the size of your research project. For example, in my doctoral work, I interviewed only 4 primary participants, 3 times each, and I did a focus group with them together at the end. That was part of my triangulation and so on. I then interviewed key players identified by them, for example, school superintendent, equity officer, etc. Just the transcripts for the 12 interviews conducted with the primary participants alone filled 1.5 very large binders, those big, thick, giant binders. And in addition, I had several other transcripts of interviews with the key players that I just talked about, documents that I had collected or that the participants had given me out of the archives in their various boards and so on, historical papers that I had collected related to the issues I was looking at, my own notes, and so on. So you can imagine I had a shelf full of binders that I was going through in trying to make meaning from all of this data that I'd collected. So how to go about best organizing all of this data so that I can use it most efficiently and effectively or whether you can, is a very, very important question. And Creswell and Guterman suggest excellent ideas for keeping track of the data, as well as technical programs that are available and quite useful for analyzing data. The only stumbling block, and I can't remember whether they mentioned this or not, but it's certainly been part of my experience in working with graduate students, doctoral students, and so on, is the learning curve is very steep for data analysis software. So if you're not familiar with it already, that needs to be factored into the timeline, and you need to have people that can help you with that. And the programs are extremely costly. So unless you have, you're in a location where you are funded through, a graduate funding mechanism, or you have access to a lab with these programs and the skills to use them, many students end up choosing more low-tech methods. So these may include coding, and I verify these because these were ones that I used and they actually work very well. Coding transcripts with colored pens, cutting and pasting parts of interviews either electronically on a computer or with scissors and glue. I've had students who have had huge maps of data spread out, cut and paste on a big wall in their study, and that's been one of the ways that they've used to code the transcripts. And it sounds a little primitive, but it actually is a very tactile learning process that for some people is very helpful. I can say from personal experience that many of these approaches work, but whatever method is used, an important question must be answered. How do I analyze and interpret it all? How can I make meaning from such a large body of information? And as usual, Creswell and Guterman give excellent advice that needs to be considered carefully. Patton, on the other hand, provides a more philosophical approach to qualitative research. How can a research establish quality and credibility for those reading the research and potentially using it to inform educational practices, public policy, and so on, as well as for the participants so that they are assured that their voice and contribution has been handled respectfully and credibly. So the first thing that Patton takes up is the issue of credibility. First, he talks about techniques and methods for establishing the credibility of qualitative research, which includes collecting high-quality data that is carefully analyzed, which Creswell and Guterman take up in detail, as we've just discussed. And he also talks about the importance of paying attention to the validity and reliability of the data and using triangulation to enrich the findings. Notice I've said enrich. It's not necessarily to confirm the findings, but to enrich the findings. So for example, in my own research, I was able to confirm and enrich the themes I identified in the data from the 4 primary participants by exploring those themes with them in a focus group, as well as with other key players. And that was a very interesting process because after my own analysis, I had put together a series of questions for the 4 main participants. And when I brought them together, I asked the first question, and I literally never had to ask the other several questions because the conversation just moved in that direction on its own. So that said to me that there was that in some ways that lent credibility to the kinds of findings that I felt I had identified in the themes that emerged. Now, of course, my voice was a part of the discussion, and you could argue that I led the discussion, but based on my transcript of that interaction, there was very little leading going on, and most of it was coming out of the discussion that these 4 participants did basically on their own, just with that first motivating question leading them into an area of analysis. So for me, that was a confirming piece of the whole puzzle that was very helpful in thinking through whether I could justifiably put forward some of the findings that I felt that I had identified. Okay, Patton talks as well as about the credibility of the researcher. And this is often a concern for beginning researchers. So that's why you take courses about research. This course and others to gain credible knowledge about the process in which you are engaged. Experience is another aspect of credibility, and that can come if you haven't done research before. That can come through practice interviews, for example, or reading deeply about others doing similar work so that you're able to be attentive to the things that are important in a research context. Experience for academics comes out of doing the research and presenting it in academic journals, conferences, teacher conference presentations, and so on. And yours will come out of doing the research, presenting it to colleagues, participants, potentially academic conferences, and so on. So your status as a graduate student, how you present yourself, your transparency in presenting your ethics to your participants, and your transparency about your position in relation to your research. For example, what is your relationship to the work you're doing? All of these things work to establish your credibility. Patton also speaks about your philosophical beliefs in the value of qualitative research or qualitative inquiry and the methods that you use for doing qualitative research. And that's something that each of you will need to come to terms with as you move forward. You will likely be doing qualitative research for a lot of practical reasons as a part of this program. And that doesn't mean that you aren't going to do other kinds of research in the future, but there are particular kinds of reasons that will be explained later on in the program to you. So if you end up doing qualitative research and that's not your preferred approach, then this, of course, will be something that you will need to be thinking through for yourself around the validity of this approach. There has been, and in some ways continues to be, a bias, and Patton talks about this, against qualitative research. It's seen as soft data rather than the hard numbers of quantitative research that may and often are seen as more valid and more credible. But Patton points to the seductiveness of numbers, particularly within neoliberal democracies. I would argue, and many others have as well, that we have entered into an age of accountability where everything must be measurable, counted, and accounted for. And this privileging of hard data, no matter what the issue or question being addressed, has become a dominant ideology that is predominant in North America, the UK, Europe, and many other countries actually, and reinforced through world organizations such as the World Bank and so on, that use this kind of data to put forward their programs. Now, I'm not arguing that they're wrong in doing so. I'm arguing that there is a privileging of a particular kind of data that pushes out of the picture other forms of coming to know something that may be helpful in certain kinds of circumstances. So, for example, in education, we see this in the power of the PISA scores, where we compare Swedish students and Japanese students and Fijian students as though all contexts are equivalent, for example, and judgments are made based on those numerical scores that affect policies and practices that those countries engage in their schools and classrooms. So numbers do matter practically and in policy, but Patton argues that we need to be paying attention to meaningfulness as well, and that both qualitative and quantitative researchers need to be striving for research that is meaningful in the webs of everyday experience and everyday existence. So while quantitative and qualitative research are different from one another, and neither is better or worse, just different, both have the potential to consider, analyze, and find meaning for all, and in whatever social, political, economic, and cultural context the questioners find themselves. And the question then becomes, what is the best approach, or what is it better to mix the approaches so that we get a more fulsome understanding of the particular phenomenon we're trying to come to an understanding of, or trying to explain in a particular kind of way. So I wanted to finish by looking at some of the practical issues that Creswell and Guterman consider, and that I feel are really important to point out. Interviews, for example, aren't the only kind of data that you might come across or that you're going to use in qualitative work. It's a very important kind of data set, but there are other ways in which it can be approached as well. So for example, there's arts-based research. I recently came across an article that looked at resiliency within First Nations, within a First Nations community, actually not too far from Edmonton, in which young people were given the technology to take pictures that had meaning to them with regard to what made them feel more or less anxious, supported, able to continue, and so on. Those pictures then, in conversation with the participants, became the focus of meaningful conversation about their relationship to resiliency and support. But it wasn't just the conversation about the pictures, but the pictures themselves became an important kind of data set. There are many excellent ways to gather research data, but there are some issues that have to be considered. So first of all, time and money are important considerations when developing a research design. It may be a really wonderful idea to go and do a comparative analysis of mathematics instruction in grades 4 and 5 in the Northwest as compared to in the Yukon, for example, as compared to Alberta, to an urban Alberta setting. So you might set up your study that way. But the cost of going and doing that collection could be so considerable in the Yukon that it's simply prohibitive. So, you know, and you'd have to stay somewhere, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those things are extremely expensive in the North. So time and money are very important, time in particular. So for example, you as students of this program need to get your research project completed within a certain period of time. So while there may be, you may have a really wonderful idea, you may not in fact have the time within the constrictions of this program to do that research. That doesn't mean you won't ever do that research. You may do it as part of a doctoral program, or you may do it as part of something that you're going to do for the board, whatever it may be. But you're going to have time available to be able to do that kind of research, and of course money as well. So these kinds of resources have to be considered. Equipment needs to be managed carefully, and my advice is have a backup. So I will give you an example. I was interviewing principals actually all over the place in BC and BC, Alberta, and Ontario, because I had connections right across those three provinces. And as it turned out, I was doing work in each of those provinces for various other projects I was working on. So I was able to collect this data actually at relatively minimal expense because it was being paid another way. But anyway, so one of the interviews that I was doing, I was using a tape recorder. Now, of course, now you use a digital recorder, but they can have their problems too. So I had this little tape recorder going, I thought, and about 3/4 of the way through the interview, and of course the last quarter was the most important and most interesting, the tape recorder had actually stopped. Had I had another one, or had I had a way of checking to make sure that it hadn't stopped, you know, I needed to pay attention to the kind of equipment that I was using, know how to use it properly, and have a backup in case something happened to my original. So you know, technology is a wonderful thing until it doesn't work. When you are interviewing a principal or a superintendent or something who, you know, has a very busy schedule and isn't liable to be very happy about having to reschedule, you know, you want to be prepared. So do trial runs too to test the questions, check your timing on the questions. Can you get it all done in an hour if that's what you set aside and said in your ethics review you're going to use? You can test out your equipment and get comfortable with that. So this is a person who may be a friend of yours and who's also a teacher or whatever, and is willing to sit there and just let you do a practice run on them. You're not going to use the data. It won't be used for anything, but it will give you an idea of what it's like, for example, to be asking a question, having the response, and then, oh, there's something interesting there that I'd like to pursue further, and doing follow-up questions and that sort of thing. So So, doing those trial runs is really, really helpful. If you're going to do interviews or do a focus group or anything where, people are going to have to pay attention to the conversation that you're engaged in, try, if it's at all possible, and it's not always possible, but if it's possible, to set up a quiet, comfortable, preferably unhurried setting for those interviews, but be prepared for changes on the fly. So, for example, I've had principals I've been interviewing, and we've set aside time in their office at the end of the day when everybody's out of the building. And I show up and some big crisis has happened and the office is abuzz with all kinds of things going on. The principal can't disengage themselves from the issue, and I have to be prepared to wait. So, that's a time management thing. Or there's something going on in the hallways because there's a practice going on or something, and you've planned to do it in the office or in a classroom or whatever, but something has happened. So it's just, being prepared and gracious when things have to change, and hope that the person involved is as well. And now all of this sounds kind of tense and whatever, but honestly, my own experience is that if you just take a deep breath and enjoy the experience, it's amazing. It's really amazing because it's a wonderful opportunity to talk to somebody about something that you both really care about, and often don't have a very large chance to talk about those issues. And so sit back, take a deep breath, and enjoy this opportunity to talk to somebody who is engaged around something that you care about, that they care about. You can carry on that conversation, and then you can do something meaningful. You can capture that meaningfulness that Patton talks about with whatever it is whatever data that you gather from that conversation or that focus group or that artwork that the person has created that is a starting point for an interesting conversation, et cetera, et cetera. There's so, as I'm even talking about this, I'm thinking about examples that were so interesting of doctoral students who have, for example, one who actually interviewed me had me draw pictures of various aspects of my experience as an administrator in a post-secondary institution. And then for me, that was a really engaging process and a thought-provoking process, and that really primed me then for the kind of conversation that we had. And that became the focus, but where it took us was so interesting. So there's so many ways in which you can engage in really deeply meaningful ways with people through qualitative research. And you can enhance often what you're doing using quantitative research as well. So I hope that this has been helpful, and as you read through the readings, I think you'll be engaged by some really interesting ideas and thought-provoking ideas about the complexity, but also the possibilities of this kind of research.